How to revise for mind and reality topics. So if you remember, this is really about the specific topics. There's an earlier section about revising in general and details of the assessment. So we have these 7 topics, and my strong suggestion to you is not to revise all of the topics, but just to take those which interest you most. In the assessment, it's very likely that you'll be asked to answer on 2 of these topics. I can't say for sure because I haven't been told what the assessment will be, but most likely it'll be 2 of these topics that you'll be asked to think about. So picking 3 perhaps to give yourself an option, or even 4 would be fine. Attempting to revise all 7 means probably spreading yourself a little thinly. But I do want to take you through all 7 just to illustrate various things that you might do with your revision. So our first topic, if you remember, was about how thoughts connect to the things about which you think. And there we looked at Russell's principle of acquaintance. Now it's actually quite hard to find accessible literature which goes further into that topic. So in a way this is a very hard topic for me. I introduced this topic because I thought it's linked to many of the things that we do. And it's really hard to take as a topic in its own right. However, we can make a connection. So for example, we could try to connect Russell on acquaintance to Frege on sense and reference. How might those 2 things connect? Now, interestingly, if you look over the last 40 years or so, philosophers have offered a variety of views about how the 2 things connect. Here's Mark Sainsbury, one of the experts on this. He says, if objects can come before the mind only under some concept or mode of presentation, then Russell's notion of acquaintance as a non-conceptual form of awareness is wrong. And I guess that makes sense. So Russell thought, of course, that acquaintance was something that you have with an object independent of any knowledge or inference. But if we think about a mode of presentation as involving a description that you know to be true of an object, then it seems that we haven't got acquaintance where sense is involved. Sainsbury goes on. This criticism shows that if acquaintance is non-conceptual, whatever mental modification is required for a subject to become acquainted with an object does not add up to the mental modification required for a subject to come to have a thought of which that object is a constituent. Now here's Sainsbury. We're going to take this on. This is very tricky. So Sainsbury's view here, of course, is controversial. Quite a few people spent a decade or 2 trying to show that the Frege and the Russellian views are compatible. Some of those are even here at Warwick. So if we're going to evaluate this, we first of all need to have a firm grasp on the notion of concept. That's something that in this course we haven't covered. The reason for that is I think that you can get a long way in philosophy without using concepts at all, and it's actually extremely difficult to get a handle on that notion. So that is something I would definitely say, look, let's handle this with care. If we need that notion of concept, then things are going to get pretty tricky. Likewise for this notion of non-conceptual, which Sainsbury is discussing. What does Sainsbury mean by non-conceptual? Is there really a distinction between the conceptual and the non-conceptual? Is there really such a thing as a concept? If so, what is it? Now these are matters which are actually very difficult to puzzle out. And I've chosen not to do that because I don't think that's terribly fruitful. So immediately here I'm faced with an obstacle in evaluating Sainsbury's view. I can kind of see, if I look at this carefully, the core idea seems, to have something to it. It seems like, how are we going to get hold of the idea that acquaintance is this relation, cognitive relation to an object, which involves neither knowledge nor inference. But on the other hand, we've seen some good arguments from Frege to think that you're always related to an object. Your point of view always involves not just the relation, but also the sense. How are we going to put those 2 things together? So if I squint at this, I can sort of understand that there's a problem here. But if I'm going to engage with Sainsbury in a thorough way, I need to know what concepts are. So there's quite a bit that's going to go into my revision if I pursue this idea on acquaintance, linking it to sense and reference. I'm not sure I should do that. Let's look at an alternative. So when it comes to cognitive penetration, we've got quite a different kind of topic from the acquaintance one. The acquaintance one essentially is a lot of difficulties in reasoning. What we've got with cognitive penetration essentially is a need to master a vast array of literature, puzzling out what evidence suggests that there is and what evidence suggests that there isn't cognitive penetration, and trying to work out the balance. Now that's a difficult thing to do, but it's quite a different task. So how would I proceed here? Well, my absolute favourite tool is to use Google Scholar, and what I'm going to do is combine that. I'm going to combine Google Scholar with my favourite article. So in my case, I think my best favourite article is this one by Chris Witzel, An Easy Way to Show Memory Colour Effects. So I'll go and search that up. And what I'm going to do here is look for those related articles. What's related to this? Maybe that will show me something that's relevant. And here I'm finding lots of things that are potentially relevant, but as I go down the list and I think about them, I'm really struck by the thought that maybe there's something interesting in perception of motion. That's something I don't remember thinking about before. All right, I'm going to go and check that out. Now, if I just click on the link, I get taken to this PsychNet website, which is a real pain for me. So what I'm going to do is to check out the other versions of that, because I don't like proving to people that I'm not a robot. Maybe I am a robot, right? What's wrong with that? Gosh. And here I notice that it's on Ovid, which is less painful to use. So here's the article, and less than a minute later I'm reading the abstract. That's very good. Now the abstract is pretty dense. This is going to be a difficult one. Gosh, am I really going to go for this? I'm not sure. I'm not sure this is going to turn out to be relevant. A lot of things here are not going to be super relevant, but maybe it's worth a look. I could at least open the paper and check out where the reference to Witzel et al. Is. And I'm struck by the thought that they're saying that human observers use familiarity in estimating motion. So I could learn something here. One last check. Is it a decent journal? Is it a decent source? It's the Journal of Experimental Psychology, A1. This is going to be an A1 source. If it's the Journal of Research or some other kind of dodgy thing or an internet resource, I'm probably not that interested. Journal of Experimental Psychology, that's going to be pretty solid. It will have been reviewed by 4 experts in the field, so it's likely to have quite a lot to it, as opposed to stuff in journals which are called Frontiers or New Discoveries or other things. Now, of course, you don't know a lot about which journals are good and which are not, maybe, so you have to use a certain amount of discretion here. So what I've suggested is that this might be worth looking at as part of my revision. I might explore this as a way of trying to go deeper into the topic. And then you might say, Steve, should our revision consist all in going deeper into the topic? And the answer, of course, is no, of course it shouldn't. Of course it shouldn't. The first thing that you need to do is actually to go back and be sure that you've got the real basics covered here, that you know what cognitive penetration is, and you know what some of the basic findings and arguments are. So it's no good sort of leaping off and doing lots of further research unless you're really clear about all of the basics. But then you might think, Steve, this is a revision lecture. Why are you not telling me about all of the basics? Good question. And the answer is because you can just go back and check out the recordings and reread the literature, go back and look at the essay you wrote. Maybe you got some useful comments on it. I hope you did, maybe you didn't, on this topic. So you can go back and look at that in order to get all of the basics. That's all still there. So what I'm really talking about here is the kind of revision that you do once you've gone back and made yourself really clear about all of the basics. That's, of course, an important process. One of the things that can happen here when you're doing the research on cognitive penetration is that you find yourself, needing to go back. Here you are, you're reading about the effect of object familiarity on the perception of motion, and you think to yourself, gosh, why is that relevant? And then you realise, I don't really understand what cognitive penetration is. So although I've gone ahead, I thought I understood everything, I've understood the basics, I'm going off to do the advanced research. It turns out that I haven't really, and then I need to go back and do some more of the basics. And that's fine too, that's a natural part of revision. One way that you learn about the limits of your understanding is precisely by attempting to go further and discovering that you can't. So what about this topic awareness? What good is your perceptual awareness of the objects around you? Now here, I think it would be wrong to say that we reached a very clear conclusion. There are topics where I think we have reached an amazingly clear conclusion and made real progress in our philosophical thinking. What we've done in the case of awareness, I think the main thing we got away from here is we do have a method for thinking about awareness. The idea is to start by thinking about what awareness is good for, and to do that by looking at the way that awareness has been operationalized, the way that it has been measured experimentally. Now there's a connection that we can make then with the issue in action. In tomorrow's lecture, we're going to cover some further material on action, a sort of extension. And one of the themes there will be that awareness plays a key role. I don't want to say too much now, but to look ahead, awareness will play a role in linking together distinct motivational systems in you, motivational systems which can actually pull you in conflicting directions towards something and away from it. And this, if we think about it carefully, might give us more insight into the question about awareness, what good perceptual awareness of objects around you is. In this case, we're thinking about your perceptual awareness of your own bodily reactions to objects. So you, of course, it involves treating yourself as an object, but it's actually very closely related to that awareness topic. So there's an interesting connection that we can make there. And a key part of the revision is, of course, just making these connections. That's one of the joys of revision, that you weave together what initially seemed like different topics. So awareness, tricky issue. What about the sense and reference thing? Well, actually, I'm going to say something about sense and reference a little bit later in this lecture, so I don't want to say too much now. I'd rather go on to metaphysics. The question that we asked was about personal identity, what's necessary for your survival as a person. But actually there is a connection here right back to that sense and reference topic. Why is that? Well, in the course of discussing sense and reference, we began to think about models of minds and actions and about the nature of mental states. When we were looking at personal identity, we were looking at psychological continuity views. But as you pointed out in the question session, we didn't say very much at all about what psychological continuity involved. Is it a matter of propositional attitudes being continuous, or is it a matter of some kind of non-propositional states, or are both important? That's a question that we can only ask because we started thinking about the nature of mental states in the sense and reference topic. So although there's no direct thematic connection there, sense and reference, personal identity, there is a kind of overlap in the background materials that we needed for those discussions. There is also, of course, a connection to the topic of awareness, and indeed you made this in the previous live session. You asked the question, when we're thinking about psychological continuity views, is awareness important there? Or could we imagine, this is my way of putting the question, not yours, could we imagine that psychological continuity would be entirely unaffected if we lost all forms of awareness entirely? Would we have still the kind of psychological continuity which is supposed to be necessary for what matters about personal identity? Now, how might I go about developing an understanding of that question? So we've got an idea that these two things are maybe connected. Maybe the psychological continuity views are somehow relying on something about awareness, so I might learn something both about personal identity and awareness by following it up. But how am I going to do that? Well, what I'm going to do, I always do this, I'm going to turn to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I'm fortunate because there's a particularly good article in that. They are, of course, varied, some are better than others, by Shoemaker on personal identity and ethics. So what I'm going to do is call that article up in my web browser and take a good look at what's in the article. And the first thing you'll notice is that I've got this rather wonderful table of contents that lays everything out so neatly. So I don't read the whole article. These things I think are not that interesting to read all the way through. Oh gosh, there's an anthropological view. What I really want is psychological continuity. But you know what? I got hooked here on identity doesn't matter. I just got distracted and it was awful. I've gone and done the wrong thing. And you know, when I'm doing this, I realised that Parfit is the key person here. Parfit is the key writer. So what I'm going to do is zip down to the bibliography, just up here, and I'm going to get Parfit's book, right, or the reference to Parfit's books, the key writings from Parfit, and take a look at those so that I can learn more about the identity doesn't matter view. So here I am in the bibliography, and I'm going down the bibliography. And do you know what I notice, actually? There's all of this really good stuff, and it's very hard to move past it, because sort of all of it's intriguing. And then I noticed just here that there is something in a journal called Philosophy and Public Affairs, which is about advanced directives and the personal identity problem. And I just can't resist that. I was supposed to be going for Parfit. I just can't resist this. So of course I put it into my Google Scholar. I've got a shortcut here. It takes me straight to Google Scholar. I hit the link here. Just as you can see this link here, I just can go straight to the JSTOR, which is a marvellous resource for me. And already I'm on the first page of that article, and I'm thinking, I wonder if the kind of like public affairs, advanced directives, that could give me new insight into personal identity. And do you know what here, Steve? You've got horribly lost. You were supposed to be researching a question about awareness and psychological continuity views. You then ended up looking at identity doesn't matter, so you didn't read the section on psychological continuity at all. And in reading that, you thought to yourself, well, I'll go and have a look at some Parfit, who after all is this beautiful writer, fabulous philosopher. So you went off and went to the bibliography, but instead of getting the Parfit references, you ended up with this thing by completely unrelated topic, right, about advanced directives. Am I going to learn anything with this mode of revision? Right? Am I going to learn anything with this mode of revision? How focused should my revision be? And I think the answer is this mode of revision is fine. That's why I've shown you. I think this is a great mode of revision. Flapping around like a little butterfly or a seed in the wind, just finding what there is out there is fabulous. But of course, what I tend to do is that at the beginning of my revision period, I'm not very focused at all. So around here, I'm just absolutely enjoying the exploration. And of course, I'm making notes as I go, but I'm doing all kinds of crazy things, right? All kinds of crazy routes. That's fine at the beginning. Over what we might call the Christmas vacation, the winter vacation. There I'm doing all kinds of crazy things. But as time goes on and that period of assessment draws nearer, I'm becoming more and more focused. I'm becoming more and more focused on actually just having answers to questions assembled, having useful material assembled, to really understanding what I'm doing and not doing crazy things where I barely even understand why I'm there. I was just drawn to it. I just couldn't resist it. And that can be very good. There's all kinds of felicitous discoveries that you can make in the early stage, but later on I'm going to be a lot more focused. Very good. Okay, so there are connections we can make. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great resource to use in making them. It's also a fabulous resource for getting lost in and finding new connections and new ideas. You might never make it out of there. We might never get back to the original issue, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine in the early stages of our revision. I don't want to say anything about action because as I say, I'm going to give you an extension lecture on action tomorrow. So we're going to cover that most thoroughly by way of revision. What then finally about the topic induction? So this is one of my favourite topics because we actually made amazing progress, I think, in answering a question: what is it for an observation to provide evidence for a scientific theory? It's not that we exactly answered that question, of course, but what we saw is that reflection on scientific method allows us to solve what Goodman called the new riddle of induction. This is a case where I think philosophers have genuinely made substantive progress in the last decade or 15 years or so. So there's really some progress in understanding different forms of reasoning that can be used to link observations to theories. So that's a really interesting thing. And of course, one thing we could do here is just follow that up. So we could just do some more reading on that topic and try to get deeper into it. The other thing we can do is deal with some nagging issues. So for me, there's a nagging issue here we've really left outstanding, and that's about the connection between cognitive penetration and the observation theory relation. When we were studying cognitive penetration, I advertised that topic as relevant in part because the occurrence of cognitive penetration would seem incompatible with a picture about the relation between observation and theory, where the observation is something more fundamental than the theory and that provides support for that theory independently of which theory you initially hold. But we looked at that only in the most superficial way possible, and it's not really clear that there is any genuine tension between the fact of cognitive penetration, if it is a fact, and the induction issue. Now I'm sort of hesitant to go there because I think on balance the evidence shows that there is no cognitive penetration, that perception is not cognitively penetrated. It's not completely decisive. We could make some new discoveries that would surprise us, but on balance we don't have good evidence at the moment for cognitive penetration. So personally I'm holding back on that issue, but I am still curious, and if you've taken a different interpretation of the evidence, you've got some good reasons for your interpretation of the evidence, so you're more persuaded that cognitive penetration is worth taking seriously, then it would be interesting perhaps to think, well, what does that really tell us about the relation between observation and theory? Or does it perhaps tell us nothing? Perhaps there isn't a connection there at all, and I'm just imagining one. So there's some further revision that I might do. Now, what you see here in all of this is I'm going through the 7 questions, picking out the ones that interest me, taking the angles that interest me most, not attempting to be comprehensive, not attempting here to be particularly broad, but to follow my own intellectual interests, build on them and develop them. As I'm doing this, what you'll notice is that the revision that I am doing is research. Revision and research are not two different things, but rather the revision that you're doing just is your research. Sometimes people think, gosh, I don't like revision. Of course, because you're here as philosophers, I wish you a great deal of joy and discovery in your revision.